Hey, Lee Robinson here from American Sentinel Canine. I appreciate y'all tuning in. I've oftentimes said be careful who you select to be your teachers. I choose my teachers to be people who can do or explain what I cannot do or explain. And on that note, I want to talk about the Ancestor Loss Coefficient. I have seen in some of the canine forums and in some of the canine YouTube channels people, and even some of the pedigrees that are specific programs that are designed for canines, something that's called the ancestor loss coefficient. And this equation is made up by someone who is clearly not a geneticist because genetically it's the formula is seriously flawed. Now, before I wanted to call this out, I actually did some research and spoke to some of the top canine geneticists in the world, and other geneticists as well, not just canine, because I was like, this just looks wrong. Mathematically, it doesn't seem correct. It didn't feel right to me on the mathematics about it, based on my understanding of meiosis, which is gamete formation, the production of sperm and egg, and recombination of genes. And so because of that, I go back to say, be careful who you select for your teachers. I don't want to step on any toes out there, so I'm not going to mention any names of anybody that's presenting this information. But mathematically, it's flawed. In case you don't know who I am, I have 2 degrees in animal sciences from the University of Illinois. I taught biology and genetics for over 25 years. I founded the American Sentinel breed 25 years ago, and my studies actually began 35 years ago. In other words, I'm pretty well in tune with a lot of what's going on with this. I also tend to be good at mathematics. Let's move on, and because I'm diverging. So let's look at the ancestral loss coefficient and get an understanding of what they're claiming it to be. And then once you understand that, then I'll show to you why this equation is really flawed. I'll also show you a few conversations that I've had with some of the top geneticists and authors on genetics in the world, and they too see that it's seriously flawed. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the screen share here and define this term, because now it's even on Google, because these people have presented it enough that Google's picked up on it. Now, just because something is popular doesn't mean it's true. But let's look at what they're claiming it to be, and then look at the flaws from the formula. So the ancestor loss coefficient, or AVK, is derived from a German term. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. I don't speak German. As a metric used in animal breeding to measure genetic diversity by tracking pedigree collapse. Now, if you don't know what pedigree collapse is, pedigree collapse means you have common ancestors repeated in a pedigree, and a result of that, you don't have the number of individuals in the pedigree that you would expect, because some of the individuals are shown in multiple places, and every time they are duplicated, you are a theoretical individual. Now, in truth, every population there is has some degree of common ancestors on the top of the bottom of the pedigree. And you might think, well, no, I don't have any line breeding or inbreeding anywhere in my family. If that was true, and you went back, let's say 20 or 30 or 40 generations, let's say you went 50 generations back, and let's say your average generation is 20 years, because today people are reproducing, maybe at 30 years of age. But in the years past, people were reproducing at 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 years of age. So let's just say the average, because for the majority of history, women were getting pregnant at 15, 16, 17, 18 years of age. But we'll just go ahead and lump it up to 20. 20 times 50 is 1,000. So that means 1,000 years ago, in 50 generations, you would expect to see so many people that we wouldn't have room for them on Earth. Let's do that equation. Let's see if my calculator can even handle it. So we're going to do 2, let me clear this, 2 to the 50th power. That is 1.126 to the 50. You got 50 zeros behind it, so that's too many. So let's go just 2 to the 40th power. That means 40 generations of, so 2 to the 40th power. That's your answer. Let me maximize this screen here. You would have that many people. Well, that would be 1 trillion people. We don't have a trillion people on the planet, okay? Well, we don't have a trillion people on the planet. So in 40 generations, you'd have to have common ancestors, right? We can see that there's going to have to be some common ancestors in the pedigree. AVK measures how many unique ancestors exist compared to the total number of possible spots in a family tree. So they're trying to compare the AVK to the coefficient of inbreeding, and that is not a comparison. Coefficient of inbreeding is a legitimate measurement in canine genetics or any kind of genetics, as is the coefficient of relationship or relationship coefficient. It says here the formula is AVK is calculated by taking the number of unique ancestors. All right, we're going to have the number of unique ancestors. I was trying to highlight that, but it won't let me do it. So we're going to have the number of unique ancestors in the population divided by the total number of ancestors, and then we're going to multiply that by 100. Well, this right here is a little bit of a mistake too, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So in a 5-generation pedigree, it says there's 62 spots. Well, if every individual is unique, that means we have 62 divided by 62, which is 1. And then you have 1 multiplied by 100, which means 1.0, or 100%, excuse me. So 1.0 is going to equal 100%. Well, 100% what? Loss? You're saying you have 100% loss of the genetics? Or what are you actually, all the spots are unique. Shouldn't the answer be 0, not 100? But we haven't even gotten to the main problem yet. We'll get there in just a minute. So really, it shouldn't be times 100. It should be, if you want to use this formula, it should be 1 minus 1, which is 0, if they were all unique. But in this situation, we'll get there in just a minute. An interpretation of 100, an AVK of 100% means that every ancestor in the pedigree is unique, no inbreeding. A lower percentage indicates ancestor loss, where where the same individuals appear multiple times. So in other words, 100% is no loss. 100% is unique. Everyone is unique. A 0 would mean complete loss, but you're going to report 0 as loss. That doesn't make sense. But anyway, let's continue. General scope. It is typically calculated over a set number of generations, most commonly 5 generations, which is 62 possible ancestors. So we're going to use 62 in their sample here, or it could be done in 10 generations. So we're going to take 2 to the 10th power, and we're going to have 1,000 ancestors. Obviously, we're not going to be looking at a pedigree trying to figure out 1,000 ancestors. I just did that on my phone here. Yeah, so you can see that was 2 to the 10th power. All right, let's go back to here. Mathematically, this is not adding up, but we'll get there in just a minute. So in a 5-generation pedigree where you have 62 spots, if 2 ancestors appeared twice, you are left with 60 unique individuals. The AVK would be 60 divided by 62 times 100, or 96.77%. Now, that means you have 96.77% as the ancestor loss coefficient, because by having 2 ancestors that are shared, 96.77% would be unique and 3.23 would be common. So by having 2 ancestors in common, you have 60 unique individuals. You have 96.77 unique, or 3.23 shared. So you would think the loss would be 3.23 if you're going to do this. But let's continue, because both of those equations, even the one I just presented, what it should be, is actually still flawed. Now, why does AVK matter? Well, a high AVK, closer to 100, generally leads to a healthier population. I don't know who's coming up with this stuff, because this is not how genetics works. Again, please hang in with me and I'll expose why. More resilient offspring with lower risk of recessive genetic defects. Now, they're assuming that nobody in the population shares a genetic recessive, okay? Next, this is something that is made up by a bunch of Karens, y'all. It says responsible breeders have an aim for an AVK above 85 to 90% unique in order to ensure sufficient genetic variety. So in other words, A high AVK promotes heterozygosity and genetic diversity. I think that the people who are presenting this are probably people like the Humane Society of the United States or PETA or something that want to eliminate pure breeds because they're trying to eliminate commonality or line breeding and inbreeding. But it doesn't work this way. Hang with me and I'll show you why. Warning signs. A low AKV can be a sign of inbreeding depression. If there's a lot of common ancestors, you can get inbreeding depression. The problem is AVK or ancestor loss coefficient doesn't tell you if there's a lot of inbreeding or not. So they're trying to say it's a signal of inbreeding, which AVK is not necessarily a signal of inbreeding, and I'll prove it to you with the pedigree, which may manifest as reduced fertility, small litter size, or weaker immune systems, even if individuals have a COI that appears to be low. All right, why is AVK a powerful tool for understanding genetic diversity? It does not account for specific traits of, okay, this is a false claim, okay? We will look at that later. In fact, let's go ahead and open this page and see if they even mention AVK. Ah, look at there, we got another canine website. So they probably do. Let's do a search find. Let me share this tab instead. So we've got a website here. Let's do a F-find, and we're gonna search for AVK and see it. So they do have it on this website. This website here, this breeder or whoever this is, does not understand genetics. I will show you why. You don't have to take my word for it. So let me go back to sharing here. Next, I asked Google, since I typed in this first question, what is this? I wanted to see what Google had to say. So I typed in this next question. If the common ancestor on one side of the pedigree, let's say the sire's side, but is in the 5th generation, and then is also on the other side, the mother's side, again in the 5th generation, what would be the AKV? Now here, this is setting Google up to realize its flaw, because I see a flaw. Well, it says in the standard 5th generation pedigree, there are 62 ancestral slots. If you have one common ancestor on the sire's side, and then once on the dam side, both in the 5th generation, now you only have one common ancestor, y'all. Let me see what this is looking like. Let me go ahead and show my face here so we can see me. So we have one common ancestor. We have 61 unique spots because there's only one individual that's sharing 2 spots. So you've only lost one unique spot. So as a result of only having lost one spot, the AVK or ancestral loss coefficient is 98.39. 61 divided by 62 multiplied by 100. You would think it would be 1 minus the 98.39. You would think it would be that, which would be 1.61, but even that wouldn't make sense because, again, the equation is flawed. All right, so they gave you that, and remember, this common ancestor is in the 5th generation on both the sire and the dam. All right. Next, inbreeding coefficient context. While your AVK would be high, the inbreeding coefficient for a common ancestor in the 5th generation is very low, approximately 0.098 for that specific path. Now, sometimes you can't trust Google, because so they're trying, it's almost like they forgot that the number's high is good in their supposed situation. Okay. Now, I asked the next question. Okay. Now, if the same common ancestor individual was not in the 5th generation on the sire side, but was the actual sire, then what would be the AVK? So in other words, on the dam side, it's in the 5th generation, but on the sire side, it is the sire. Well, if the sire itself appears in the 5th generation on the dam side, then the AVK drops slightly more than the previous scenario because that one individual is now filling multiple spots in the pedigree. In a 5th generation pedigree, there's 62 spots. Well, let's look at this. It says it drops. It doesn't drop. It's 98.39, 61 divided by 2. So in other words, they're showing you that if it's in the 5th generation twice up here, hey baby, I'm making a YouTube video, okay? So here, if there's one common ancestor in the 5th generation twice, you got 98.39. And here, if it's in the 5th generation on one side, but the sire on the other side, you got 98.39. In other words, the AVK, regardless of if that individual is in the 5th generation or the parent, as long as it's in there twice, you get the same number. Well, that doesn't make any sense because the genetics that's going into the offspring, the formed baby, the formed zygote, which becomes the embryo, which becomes the fetus. Okay, the zygote becomes the blastocyst becomes the embryo becomes the fetus, and then you got the pup. All right, that pup is going to have totally different genetics, whether it's the sire or the great-great-great-grandsire. Okay, it's not the same at all, but you give you the same ancestral loss coefficient. Doesn't make any sense. But let's continue with Google and see if Google can realize the fallacy. Then I'll show you how professors also notice the same mistake. So why is it the same as before? The AVK, a count of unique individuals versus available spots. In your first scenario, Ancestor X was in the 5th generation twice, 2 spots. In the second scenario, the sire is in the 5th generation of the dam. Okay, 2 spots, 1 unique dog, 1 unique dog. Mathematically, you still have 61 unique dogs in a 62 dog pedigree or family tree. So the AVK remains the same. However, the coefficient of inbreeding would change significantly. In one situation, the coefficient of inbreeding is not even 1%. It's not even 1/10 of 1%. This right here is the 1% column or the percent column. This is the decimal point. So this is 1/10 of a percent. This is 9/100ths of a percent. So in this scenario, you have less than 0.1%. Now let's remember 1.0 equals 100%. Okay, now that means that 0.01 equals 1%, which means 0.098% does not equal 9.8%. It equals 0.00 and then another 0 because you have a decimal point with a 0 after it and then a 9.8. That's what that equals. And then we're going to compare this number here to this number here, which is 3.125, or in other words, 0.03125. These two numbers are drastically different. So as a result, AVK, what is it trying to measure? This is like nothing. This is not 1%. This is not 1/10 of 1%. It is less than 1/10 of 1%. All right. We're talking about 98 thousandths of a percent. Okay. All right. Next. It's so low that I have to like double check my math to make sure I've got it right. But yes, I do. I've got it right. All right. Next. While the AVK diverse score says you have a very diverse family tree, the COI risk tells you that the offspring is more tightly bred in the sire than it was in the 5th distant ancestor. There's a dramatic difference here. Most breeders use the AVK alongside COI to get the full picture of genetic health. Would you like to know how COI would change if the ancestor paired with an even closer generation of the parent? Nope, I don't, because I'm looking at this bogus AVK formula. So I asked Google, let's see if it starts to realize the flaw. As a result of both of these situations producing the same AVK, it seems to me that this is a terrible method, referring to the AVK, to measure anything in genetics, as the first method has a much more diluted influence, being in the 5th generation, than does the latter, being the sire. Being that the latter situation, the sire would be a 50% genetic contribution, but in the prior, in the 5th generation, would only have a 3.125 genetic contribution. This is what I asked Google. 0.5 times 0.03125 is not even close to being the same as 0.03125. Excuse me, 0.03125 times 0.03125. So in this situation, the common parent is the sire on the top side and in the 5th generation on the bottom side. So its genetic contribution, if you want to look at the coefficient of relationship, we would add that. Okay. But I can't change that. So we can see that these two situations are not even close. And it says it's starting to realize I'm right. You're absolutely right. This is why the AVK, ancestral loss coefficient, is never used as a standalone genetic metric by any serious breeder. Your logic highlights the exact mathematical flaw that geneticists warn about. Why is AVK is blind to this influence? Well, the AVK is a quantity-only metric. It doesn't care about the weight or the proximity, meaning how close it is to the offspring. It doesn't care if it's the parent, the grandparent, the great-grandparent, or the great-great-grandparent. It's not caring about that. In other words, it's a complete nonsense in terms of genetic analysis by any professional. The flaw, AVK, measures pedigree collapse, how many spots are filled by the same individual, but ignores where those spots are. This is why it's no good. As a result, the result, as you noted, a dog appearing in 30 generations back and a dog appearing as a sire both account exactly the same as -1 to a unique ancestor, resulting in the same AVK score, even though their genetic impact is leagues apart. All right. Okay, so since I graduated from the University of Illinois, I wanted to reach out to a professor at the University of Illinois. And I found Dr. I'm reaching out to you because I'm looking for some input on a particular genetics topic from an accredited and qualified individual in the field of genetics. I graduated from the University of Illinois Department of Animal Sciences in '93 and got my master's degree in '97. Taught biology and genetics for 25 years, but a few years ago I came across a concept called Ancestor Loss Coefficient, or AVK. And frankly, it does not seem to me to be a valid measurement. I've never seen this topic in an accredited course or textbook, but found it online with some registries. We operate a canine program as well as a few online registries. As a result, I'm curious if this is just some made up, oversimplified formula for a number of reasons. And I see a few flaws in the concept, which I can quickly explain and simply explain if you have time for a brief call. He replied back, to be honest, I'm not an expert at canine genetics. I haven't heard about the concept of ancestral loss coefficient. It appears as if it's only mentioned on blog posts about canine breeding, as you mentioned. I thought it might be better to ask for opinions from an expert such as Adam Boyko at Cornell or other fields who may be more qualified to answer this topic. So I took his advice and reached out to Adam Boyko. Okay, now over here, we have a response from Dr. Boyko. So same question. I reached out to Boyko, and he is from Cornell. I told him my question, and he replied back. I'm traveling in a meeting, or I'd otherwise call. We have just missed each other at the University of Illinois. I was there in '95 and a double major in Triple E, which is ecology, ethology, and evolution, and computer sci. Ecology, ethology, and evolution is a really cool field. I almost went into that myself. I agree, the ancestral loss coefficient is oversimplification with several flaws. Pedigrees only go back so far and assume the founders are unrelated, which is never the case. In other words, if you go back far enough in a pedigree, you're going to have common founders in every population, whether it be Adam and Eve, Noah and his descendants, and if you don't believe in that, just any breed of dog. They have common ancestors if you go back far enough. And if you go back far enough, the number of individuals in the population that ever existed will be less than the number of spaces in a pedigree. For example, let's just prove that real quick on my calculator. Let's say, let me clear it out and show you here full screen. If I take 2, let's see if we can show this on the computer. And we're going to take it x to the y power right here, and then I'm going to enter 40. Okay, after I've entered 2 to the 40th power, we're going to hit equal. And wait, what is that? That's 1 trillion. There are not a trillion people on the planet, y'all. There's not a trillion people on the planet, and if you add up all the people that ever existed, it wouldn't be a trillion. There's never been a trillion people, and that's only in 40 generations. And let's say the average generation is 20, 25 years. Let's just say 25, which the average generation is going to be less than 25, because even though people today are having children at 25 and 30 and 35, the average child was probably well, let's say the average woman in history, let's just go back 100 years. Women were having kids before they were 20. Go back 100 years before that, when women were having children when they were 15, 16, 17, 18 years of age. Now, maybe the average would have been around 20, but we'll bump it up to 25 for simplicity reasons, because 40 times 25 is 1,000 years. You're telling me within the last 1,000 years there's been 1 trillion people? No, that's how many spots there are in a pedigree in 40 generations. 1 trillion spots. So there's going to have to be common ancestors, which is never the case. So there's going to have to be common ancestors. Calculations of inbreeding and ancestor loss coefficients from pedigrees are just estimates. The actual inbreeding or genetic diversity lost is best described at the DNA level, since it depends on the specific patterns of gene segregation and transmission of the DNA through the pedigrees. Happy to hear if you have thoughts about it. I was not aware that some groups were advocating using it as a metric to guide canine breeding programs. Thanks for raising the issue. So this Dr. Boyko may come out and address this in the canine industry. I mentioned this to him back in 2024, October of 2024. Hopefully he'll present a book on it now that I brought this topic to his light, because this is a master of canine genetics. I pointed out that if you had 5-generation pedigree and you counted up all the generations in 5 generations, you had to have 62 spots. And if one of those spots was in the 5th generation versus the sire, you get totally the same answer, but maybe he'll address that in the canine community. But he wasn't the only professor I spoke to about it. I also spoke to Dr. Weinrich, who's at Brown University, who's another one of the top geneticists. And I have purchased his book. This is a phenomenal geneticist. If you want a great book on canine genetics, if you want a great book on genetics, I recommend his book, because I had actually purchased it. I purchased his book on population genetics, and asked him if he had ever heard of ancestral loss. He actually comes back and he says, "Thank you so much for your message. It's tremendously gratifying to hear that you find the book useful. I was not familiar with the ancestral loss coefficient." You're going to tell me that one of the leading professors of population genetics, who's never heard of a formula, but you're going to use it because some blogger on YouTube or because of some blogger on Facebook recommended it to you? It doesn't work this way, y'all. It really doesn't. So what's the difference? The difference is the RC, or relationship coefficient, or COR, coefficient of relationship, and the COI, which is coefficient of inbreeding. Those are all valid. But this AVK, this ancestral loss coefficient, that is complete nonsense. So let's go ahead and look at this next page. All right, so here we're going to look at the pedigree of Congo. Congo is out of Vicious and Halo. Vicious is out of Lucky 7, bred to Onyx. Halo is out of Little Rascal, bred to Valkyrie. Now, this dog here, Little Rascal, and Lucky 7 are both outcrosses to the American Sentinel program. You'll notice no individual in this part of the pedigree is seen anywhere else in this pedigree, and no individual in this section of the pedigree behind Lucky 7 or Little Rascal is anywhere else in the pedigree. There are a few common ancestors between Onyx and Valkyrie, and here's another flaw with the AVK. So Valkyrie is actually a full sister to Justice right here. Justice and Valkyrie were littermates, or not littermates, but they have the same 2 parents, Preacher Man and Blue Jean. So while the AVK is calculating that these 2 parents take up a common spot, it's not calculating that these 2 parents share a common spot, because they don't. They're 2 different individuals, but yet they have a 50% coefficient of relationship, and that doesn't get counted. So that's a flaw right there. Next, if we look here, Tiggy is also in the pedigree, and she is not counted as the same as Justice and Valkyrie, even though Tiggy is also a full sibling. Yes, the parents are counted, but they don't get counted at all. So that's another flaw with the AVK formula. It is complete nonsense. Anyway, I hope that brings some light to this subject because, again, it's important to select your teachers wisely. I choose my teachers by looking for people who can do or explain what I cannot do or explain. And you might find somebody that can explain this formula, but you also need to understand its application. And if you don't understand genetics, you might be able to do the math on the formula and think, like Elon Musk says, why are we even doing this? So there's no need to optimize the efficiency of something you don't even need because it's nonsense to begin with. Y'all take care. I hope you've enjoyed the video and have a blessed day.